We are beginning what's called the nations section. I want to spend a little time talking about the nations section and the value of that before we get to rolling on Egypt here in a moment. There are 9 nations that are mentioned here in this context. That's not the only nations that God deals with. But here's a sampling of those nations, and there are 9 that are mentioned. We're going to look at 8 of those tonight. Babylon is the next one, and there are 2 chapters devoted to Babylon that we'll get to. But we have Egypt, Philistia, Moab, Ammon, Edom, Syria, Kedar, and Elam are mentioned in our study tonight. Now, we've had the national section. I hope you remember these 3 major sections: the national section, the personal section, and now the international section dealing with that of the nations. Several prophets, not every single prophet, but several of the prophets has a nations section. And so what is accomplished in this section? I quote from Walter Kaiser. He said, "Such oracles of judgment appear in most prophetic books." For example, Isaiah 13, that's the first one comes to mind when someone mentions a nation section. I think of that one first. We've already covered that. When we get to Ezekiel, see Ezekiel 25 to 32, Amos 1 and 2. And most of the books of Obadiah, Jonah, and Nahum. So there must be something to that when you take most of these minor prophets. Now, Obadiah, we'll give some attention to that tonight. But Obadiah is just a one chapter book. But nonetheless, most of that book, Jonah and Nahum, are dealing with nations, or much of it is. And then there's sections in Ezekiel, Amos, Isaiah, and Jeremiah. There must be something important about that. And so you look here at Jeremiah chapters 46 to 51. And so, that's 4, 5, 6, that's 6 chapters, isn't it? 6 chapters are devoted to the nations. And if this were just a cursory reading we were doing, we'd get to this and we'd say, this is not the most interesting. I got real interested in that personal section when Jeremiah was in prison and put in a dungeon, etc. I got interested and excited. But this is not real exciting to talk about Egypt and Ammon and Moab and Edom. And so what value is there in that? And that's what we want to focus on just for a few moments. And so I hope you'll make a note. Perhaps this would be good if you have a room in the margin of your text. I have these reasons given in the margin of my text. In fact, this is one of the things you're looking for in your handout, but this would be good when you open up to Jeremiah 46 next time you see these reasons. So what's accomplished? What's learned here? Well, first of all, God is in control of the nations. God rules in the kingdoms of men. We see that in Daniel 4. We'll get to Daniel in the Sunday morning classes starting in January. We're going to see that over and over. So I'm learning that God is in control of the nations. It's not that the nations are doing whatever they want to do and God's just sitting back watching. God's in control of the nations. Secondly, I learned from these sections that God is the God of all the nations. You say that's the same thing. No, that's a different point. The point here is that it's not that Egypt has their God and Israel has their God, and our God is not the God of the Egyptians. They've got their God controlling them, and Israel's got their God controlling them. The God of Israel is the God of all the nations. He's controlling every other nation and every other God. And so I learned that in this context. I learned that God uses nations as tools. If I learn anything from the prophets, I'm learning this. God uses nations as tools, and He could be using the United States as a tool, or He could be using China as a tool, or maybe it's Russia as a tool, and maybe it's against us. Could God do that? Well, certainly so. He used Babylon against Israel and Judah, or against Judah, and Assyria against Israel. Now, another thing I'm learning, God's fair in dealing with the nations. It wouldn't seem fair for God to punish Egypt for their sin, but not Judah for the same thing. Nor does it seem fair for God to bring down Judah when they sin, but Egypt when they do the same thing, or Edom. Shows God's fair in dealing with the nations. Furthermore, we learn from this, God is working out His purpose in time. And so God is preserving a nation. He's going to preserve the nation of Israel. And one of the ways of doing that is using other nations as tools to accomplish His purpose. God's working out His purpose in time. Revelation 4 and in, Revelation 4. We'll just leave it at that. The nations are held accountable just as individuals. I don't mean that go to heaven as a nation or you're destroyed and gone to torment as a nation. But what that does mean, God holds the nation as a whole accountable, and when the nation is done, God's done with the nation. He was with Judah, he was with Israel, he was with Egypt, he was with Edom, he was with, on down the line, you name it. And so, in an application, when God's done with the United States, God's done. And there's not a power on earth, there's not a president, there's not a Congress that can stop it. When God's done with us, he's done. And he may be done. The next thing I'm learning is that God will strike a nation and yet God will heal a nation. We'll give a little attention to the strike and heal all through tonight's lesson. In fact, we've got a little chart on that here in just a moment. That God will strike a nation, but yet God heals the nation. And so we're going to see some of that. Then we're going to see the reason the nations are destroyed, and that's because of sin and rebellion in the nation. It's not that this nation is being destroyed because this nation is more powerful and they get to overtake that nation. But God's letting this nation take that nation because that nation is in sin and God's ready to destroy that nation. When God's not ready, it doesn't happen. And so a great deal is accomplished. This is very valuable. And so I thought today as I was working through this study that why did God say so much? For example, let's just get ahead of ourselves. Like in chapter 48. Chapter 48 deals with Moab, and there's 47 verses, and they're not short verses. Why did God say so much about Moab? I don't have to know why he said that. The fact that God wrote 47 verses on Moab meant he wanted me to read 47 verses about Moab. Does that make sense? And so consequently, I need to study what God has said. Now, the next thing I want us to look at is not anything you're going to be edified by, but it may be something you'll win a Bible trivia game over. And that's about all you're going to get out of this. You're not going to walk away with any edification. But this is just interesting. And that is in the Hebrew text and in our English text, these nations are mentioned in this order: Egypt, Philistia, Moab, Ammon, and Edom, and Damascus, and Kedar, and Elam, and Babylon. There's your 9 nations. But in the Septuagint translation, which was a good translation, and I know that because the Lord and the apostles quoted from that translation, they're listed in a different order and a different reference given to those. And in other words, it's not in chapter 46. So the first nation to be mentioned, and many think this was the original order in which it was given. I don't know that for sure. But Elam is first, the second is Egypt, the third is Babylon, the fourth is Philistia, and the fifth is Edom, and the sixth is Ammon, and the seventh is Kedar, and the eighth is Damascus, and the ninth is Moab. Now, I warned you ahead of time, you're not going to get any edification out of that. That's just kind of interesting to me that it appears different in the Septuagint. I take that chart from Kaiser. Now, another thing before we get to the flow of the text is the smite and heal, or as some call it, the smatter and restore message. That is, you'll see when God deals with a nation, he did this with Judah, did it with Israel. I'll smite the nation, I'll punish the nation, and yet I will restore. And that almost seems contradictory to the fact that God in other places, and we'll see some of that tonight, that I'm going to make a complete end of the nations, but not of Judah. So what in the world is this about? Well, in tonight's lesson, this is just a sampling of this, and I just give the references with reference to these 4 nations. Now, he doesn't mention this with every nation, but these 4 of the 8 we're looking at, he mentions Moab. He's going to, and he doesn't always use the word smite, but he's going to bring destruction upon them, and then there is a healing. And over here with Ammon, there's a smiting, and then there's the healing, and then the same thing with Egypt, and the same thing with Elam. Now, I quote from Humphreys here, and I think he's got captured the thought here. He said, one will look in view through his to the nations to find the literal fulfillment of this statement. Will look in vain. I should say in vain. That's why I got hung up on that. I mistyped that. That a person's going to look in vain through the history of the nations to find the literal fulfillment of this statement. The passage is figurative and therefore clearly messianic. Now get the point. What he's saying, and I think he's right. When God said, I'm going to take the nation of Moab and I'm going to smite them, but then I will heal them. He's talking about in the day of the Messiah. And the same thing with reference to Egypt, the same thing with reference to Ammon, and the same thing with reference to Elam. And so it's not talking about rebuilding the nation, but the smite and heal, the healing part, is messianic. We'll call attention to that as we go along. Now, we've got a lot to cover, so we're going to move on. You're looking for this in your handout. This is a summary of the 4 chapters. We have the judgment upon Egypt, the judgment upon Philistia, or the Philistines, and then the judgment upon Moab, and then here's the judgment on 5 smaller nations. And so those 5 plus those 3 that we noticed, 46 to 48, makes 8 of the 9 we're looking at. So now let's take time to turn over to chapter 1, and you might make a note at chapter 46. Well, let's go to 46:1 first, and then we're going to go backwards. Let's go to 46:1. The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet against the nations. You might make a note at 46:1 to see chapter 1 in verse 5. So let's go over to chapter 1 in verse 5. So in Jeremiah 1 in verse 5, we saw this then, but to tell you the truth, I had forgotten this statement was in chapter 1. The chapter 1 in verse 5, God said to Jeremiah, I ordained you a prophet, and at the end of the verse, to the nations. Not just to Judah, but to the nations. So make a note at chapter 1 verse 5 to see chapter 46:1. So you've just tied those 2 verses together. Now look at verse 10, the same thing. I have set you over the nations and over the kingdoms to root out, to pull down, to destroy, etc. So here are references that Jeremiah was a prophet not just to Judah. We're talking about him being to the southern kingdom. He was a prophet to the nations. And so he's prophesying concerning Egypt, Philistia, Moab, and on down the line. So let's start with this. Here's the prophecy against Egypt. The prophecy against Egypt. Now, you ought to know where Egypt is, but if you want to get a bearing on the map, this is Palestine right here. And you probably can't see, but here's the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. So here is Palestine, and this is Egypt down here on our map. That's where he's prophesying to the nation of Egypt. Now we're going to talk about what happened here in just a moment. So beginning at verse 2, concerning the army of Pharaoh Necho, the king of Egypt, which is by the river Euphrates, in Carchemish. There was a battle at Carchemish. And this was in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah. Might put a marginal note if you don't already have it. 605 BC is when this battle took place. Now, who is this Pharaoh? Pharaoh was the title given to the king, so there were various pharaohs. So just when you read of a pharaoh, it's not always the same pharaoh, obviously, like president or prime minister or whatever. This is the same Pharaoh that had killed Josiah. The same Pharaoh that had killed Josiah 3 years earlier, according to 2 Kings chapter 23 and in verse 29. Now, what happens here in this battle, this is from Lagos map where they are showing here, this, as you know, I don't know the colors, but whatever color this is, this shaded area was Babylon, the territory of Babylon, before Nebuchadnezzar takes Egypt, before he defeats in this battle, Egypt in 605 BC. And then this area here is included, whatever this shaded color area right here, is the area that is captured and is taken after this battle. So this was a decisive battle. There was taking control basically of Egypt, but Egypt wasn't invaded yet. That didn't happen for some years later, about 571 to 567 BC, according to Bible Knowledge Commentary. But be that as it may, let's work our way through some things about Egypt now. Pharaoh shall be defeated at Carchemish. Now, we just saw where Carchemish was. I meant to point that out to you while we were looking at that map, but let's go back. Carchemish is right here. So we're north of Palestine. So this little map, I meant to point out that these lines are indicating perhaps the traveling of Pharaoh coming up here, trying to deal with Nebuchadnezzar, and make sure that Pharaoh that Egypt has control of Palestine, and that he's got control. He's going to try to take Babylon as well, but it didn't work that way. Nebuchadnezzar drove him all the way back to Egypt, and we'll say more about that as we go on. So let's look at the announcement, verses 1 and 2. Verses 1 and 2 just says, here's the announcement of what's taking place. We've already covered that. Now let's begin at verse 3. Here is a poem that mocks Egypt for their defeat. And so here's the mockery. Beginning at verse 6, God sarcastically calls. There is a place for sarcasm, so that's not a reflection on God. He sarcastically calls them to prepare for battle. So order the buckler and the shield, a small shield that protects the head and one that protects the body, and harness the horses and mount up your horsemen and set forth your helmets and polish your spears. In other words, get everything ready for battle and get going and you're ready to go to battle. Now, this is, by the way, the first stanza, as we call it, of this poem. It gets us through verse 6. But notice what God said. He said, why have I seen them dismayed and turned back? The Babylonian Chronicle suggests that there was mass confusion, running in all direction and retreating and going back. The battle at Carchemish didn't go very well. Didn't go very well at all. For Egypt, that is, it didn't go very well. And so it's a picture of chaos. Look at verse 5. There's fear all around, says the Lord. Do not let the swift flee away, nor any man escape. So what's the point? The point is that God, in this poem mocking them, in the first stanza, get everything ready for battle. And when you go to battle, why is it you're fleeing in every direction? I thought you were ready to take Babylon. Y'all seem scared to death when you battle. Now the second stanza begins at verse 7 and goes through 12. And it talks about the arrogance of Egypt, where Egypt was coming up like a flood. In other words, Egypt was not as mighty as she thought she was, that they thought they would rise like the river Nile, like their own river, whose waters move like the rivers, and Egypt rises like a flood, and say, I will go and cover the earth, and I will destroy the city of the inhabitants. And so Pharaoh, as he's leading Egypt, has this picture, we're like the river Nile, we're going to overflow our banks, and we're going to flood the earth. And we're powerful and we're mighty. Well, you're not as powerful, God is saying in this poem, as you thought you were. Now, at verse 9, there is help. There's not going to be any help. And so the Ethiopians and the Libyans and the Lydians on the west coast of Asia Minor, all of these were people battling in formation with them and helping them, and it's no help at all. So whatever help they had is not going to work at all. Now at verse, look at verse 10. I'm skipping sections to get to key points. The sword shall devour, and it shall be satisfied or satiated and made drunk with blood. It pictures a sword as if it could drink. And this sword is not satisfied until it's drunk with blood. In other words, I am going to bring vengeance and destruction upon Egypt. Now notice at verse 11, nothing's going to help. This is part of that second stanza of this poem. That go up to Gilead for balm, and in vain you will use many medicines and you'll not be cured. Nothing you're going to do is going to help. And so the poem basically mocks. Now notice how the second stanza ends. Let's go back to the end of verse 6 though. That they will stumble and fall toward the river toward the north by the river Euphrates. They're in a battle and they stumble and fall by the river. That's how the first stanza ends. How does the second stanza end? Look at the end of verse 12. For the mighty men have stumbled against the mighty, and they have fallen together. Same way that the first stanza ends. Like a song, ending on this note, coming back and ending on that same kind of phraseology. Now, beginning at verse 13. So Pharaoh shall be defeated at Carchemish. Destruction is coming to Egypt. Egypt is not as great as they thought. Nebuchadnezzar is going to invade and will smite Egypt. Now, there's an interesting phrase used here. Let's get to that in just a moment. He mentions, make this proclamation. Well, let's look at verse 13. The word of the Lord spoke to Jeremiah, how Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, will strike the land of Egypt. Now, cities are mentioned at verse 14. The Noth is Memphis, is a well-known city in Egypt. And the sword devours all around you. Now, this is quite interesting at verse 15, and there's a textual problem, and I'll try to point that out at verse 15. That why are your valiant men swept away? They do not stand. And the answer is because the Lord drove them. Now, that's interesting. I'll get the textual question in a moment. But the point is, your mighty men that were supposed to be so strong were all swept away. Instead of being a flood, you were in a flood, is what happened. And you washed away. Why is that? Because God did it to you. Now, the Septuagint raises the question, separate some words here. Where has Apis fled? Apis was the god that they worshipped, a god of fertility. And if that translation be correct, or if that rendering be correct, and the New Revised Standard Version, I believe, uses that same phraseology. If that's correct, and it may have been, I'm not saying that it is, that what it may be alluding to is your God was no help to you. What happened to your God? Your God fled away because your God's no help. And it certainly wasn't. Now this is interesting at verse 17. They cried and said that Pharaoh is but a noise, his time he has passed by the appointed time. You might underline that. What does that mean? It means his time's over. Your time's up. It's over. Egypt, Pharaoh, your time's up. You're done. Startling statement. God may tell you one day your time's up, and may tell me the same thing. Now let's talk about the assurance here at verse 18. This is quite interesting. What assurance do they have when the prophet Jeremiah says Nebuchadnezzar is coming, that he's coming? And the assurance is, as I live, says the king whose name is Lord of hosts. If God's alive, he's coming. So God said he's coming. He's coming. As I live. Just as sure as God is alive, Nebuchadnezzar is coming. And just as sure as Tabor is among the mountains and Carmel is by the sea, just as sure as the mountains are standing. Look over and see if they're standing. Oh yeah, they're standing. Then he's coming. So is your God alive? Yeah, he's alive. Are the mountains still standing? He's coming. That's interesting. You can count on him. Now, here's how severe it will be. Look at the end of verse 19. There's going to be utter waste and severity. Now, you're looking in your outline for 3 or 5 comparisons beginning at verse 20. And let's see what they are. The first is, Egypt is like a pretty heifer, but destruction comes. And so here is a pretty heifer that's going to be destroyed. Destruction is coming. Some of these overlap. The second one is at verse 21, your mercenaries, your soldiers, are in the midst like fat bulls. What do you mean fat bulls? That have been fattened for slaughter. Any farmer knows if you've got cattle and you're fattening them up, you're fattening them for slaughter. You got hogs, you're fattening them for slaughter. He said your soldiers are like fat bulls, been fattened for slaughter. That's interesting. The third comparison is at verse 22, you flee like a serpent. Like a serpent that's afraid. Some serpents may not be afraid of you, and they may come towards you, but some serpents, when they see you, they flee and they go away. You're fleeing like a serpent, trying to get away. The fourth is you're like a tree, verse 22 and 23, that's going to be chopped down. What's Egypt like? A tree. God's going to cut you down, going to cut you off. And then the fifth thing is you're being invaded as by locusts or grasshoppers. You're a nation, the grasshoppers come in and devour and leave nothing. The locust really is a picture. The locusts come in and they devour everything around and strip the land bare. And so Nebuchadnezzar is coming in and going to strip you bare. Those are the 5 things you're looking for in your handout. Now, let's get down to verse 26. Well, notice at verse 24, Egypt shall be ashamed, and the people of the north are coming. Now, verse 25 is important, because here's where we have the smite and heal. That I will bring punishment on Ammon and Ammon, rather. That's a sun god. So notice, I'm going to bring your gods down. I'm going to bring your cities down. I'm going to bring your king down, and all who put their trust in him. The whole nation, from the gods to the king and the people, are coming down. God's bringing devastation and destruction. Now notice, and you might mark at the end of verse 26, afterward it shall be inhabited in the days as in the days of old, says the Lord. That's probably messianic, because I don't know of any fulfillment where the nation was rebuilt and that there was a remnant that came back like with Judah, etc. But I do know that in the days of the Messiah, people from all nations, that's the idea. That's the smite and heal. God smites every nation, but people from every nation have a chance to be healed. And so that's the smite and heal. It's messianic, I take. Now we'll quickly get the rest of that and get 47. It's a short chapter, and see if we can get back on schedule. My earlier analysis of some things kind of put us a little behind. So what we have now is the promise of deliverance for Jacob. That is the people of God. So 3 things he says here, 27 and 28, only 2 verses here. They're going to return. I'm starting in the middle of the verse in interest of time. For behold, I will save you from afar, and your offspring from the land of captivity. Jacob shall return, have rest. So you're going to come back to the land. You're going to come back to the land. There is the return. And notice verse 28 describes a remnant. Do not fear, O Jacob, your servant, for I am with you, and I will make a complete end of all the nations to which I have driven you, but I will not make a complete end of you. If God's not going to make a complete end of them, then there always has been, there always will be a remnant. I firmly believe that. Romans 9, I believe every prophet talks about a remnant. And so they're going to come back and there will be a remnant. And it's that remnant that God's trying to take care of, because it's through this remnant the Messiah ultimately comes. The third thing mentioned in that context is you're going to be corrected. I will rightly correct you, for I will not leave you wholly unpunished. In other words, I'm going to smite these nations, and I'll make an utter end of them. But the healing of those nations had to do with the Messianic prophecy. But I'm going to make an utter end of the nations. But I'm not going to make an utter end of my people. But I am going to punish you. I am going to punish you. And that's what he says. All right, that's chapter 47, the prophecy against Egypt. Now let's move on to 47. 47 is a little short chapter. And this is concerning Philistia. Only 5 verses here. You are familiar with where Philistia is. You see the Dead Sea or the Salt Sea and the land of Philistia, the land of the Philistines. You'll see have references to Gaza and Ashkelon, etc. You'll see some of those cities, or we'll talk about some of those cities. Timnah is going to be mentioned here. 2 things happen in 47. Let's quickly get it so we can move to Moab. It's not that this is unimportant, it's just a short chapter and we can get through it. The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah against the Philistines before Pharaoh attacked Gaza. And so what we have in verses 1 and 4, they're going to be invaded from the north. Behold, the waters rise out of the north. That's a reference to Babylon. Now, Babylon was actually to the to the east. But they have to come across the Fertile Crescent and come down. And that's why Babylon is always pictured as coming in from the north. So you're looking for that in your handout. You may want to make a marginal note as well. So they're going to be invaded. Now at verse 3, the fathers will not look back for their children. It's like fathers fleeing and not looking back to make sure their children come because they're lacking courage. Because there's going to be plunder, and there's going to be cutting off of Tyre and Sidon, and every helper remains, for the Lord shall plunder the Philistines. Now, Caphtor, mentioned at the end of verse 4, is the place of their origin. Some think that's in Asia Minor. Some commentators will mention that. More likely, that has reference to the island of Crete, and that was the most likely place of their origin. Now, the results of the invasion, let's quickly get that. There's going to be baldness, verse 5, upon Gaza and Ashkelon. It's going to be cut off. In other words, utter destruction. Now, this is an interesting point. At verse 6, O you sword of the Lord, how long until you are quiet? In other words, this is a cry for mercy and a cry for peace. In other words, leave us alone. And so it's like Philistia saying, the sword of the Lord is coming to us. We know the Lord's sword is here, even though it's Babylon coming in. This is the sword of the Lord that's coming to punish. When will the sword be quiet? And the answer is, how can it be quiet? Seeing the Lord has given it a charge. If the Lord told the sword to do something, it's going to do it, and it's not going to be quiet until when? Well, let's see. Against Ashkelon and against the seashore, there he has appointed. In other words, it's not going to be quiet until the work is done. So when the Lord, let's fast forward to 2022. If the Lord's sword is after a nation, and when will that sword be quiet? When the work's done, when God's done, when God's finished doing what he wants. That's when it'll be quiet. And it's not going to be quiet until. How can it be quiet? Is the point that's raised. And so we're ready to leave that. Now, that's the Philistines. Judgment against the Philistines. But that phrase of the sword being quiet. When will it be quiet? When the work's done. So let's move now to chapter 48. It's a long chapter, but let's see if we can make our way through these 47 verses here. And let's talk about the land of Moab. Moab, where is Moab? This is the Dead Sea or the Salt Sea. And Moab is, as you can see, is just to the south east, and that's where they are. Now, what do we know about the people of Moab? These are descendants of Lot. These are descendants of Lot. Now, let's work our way through 48 because we've got to get to 49. We want to say some things about 49. So we don't want to leave that out. So let's get going here with 48. This is a prophecy against Moab. And the first thing I want us to see is great destruction is coming. Let's hit some high points in verses 1 to 6. Woe to Nebo, for it is plundered. You might underline the word plundered. The stronghold is shamed, verse 1. Verse 2 talks about the cry, come and let us cut her off, the cry of the people, of the enemy, come let us cut her off, and let us cut down Moab. And notice at the end of verse 3, plundering and great destruction. Verse 4, Moab is destroyed. There's continual weeping at verse 5. And flee for your lives, verse 6. And be like the juniper in the wilderness. In other words, verses 1 to 6, great destruction is coming upon Moab. Now let's focus on 7 to 13. Moab's pride is going to bring a curse upon himself. Notice the pride that, and you might circle or underline, at verse 7, for because you have trusted in your works and in your treasures. That's pride. You might write pride out to the side. We're going to see more about pride over at verse 29. But because you thought so much of yourself that you shall be taken, and Chemosh, that's a god, their god, that's not going to help them, is going to go into captivity. So because of your pride, is why you're going into destruction, and your God's not going to help you at all. Now, verse 10, I've got to say something about verse 10. Cursed is he, and I think you're looking for something on your handout. If you didn't, I should have put something there. But anyway, verse 10. Cursed is he who does not work, let me start over. Cursed is he who does the work of the Lord deceitfully, and cursed is he who keeps back his sword from blood. You say, wow, I don't know what that's about. Well, this is in the context of a nation being punished by another nation. So I've made a marginal note, and perhaps you could too, that other nations are used as tools of God. That's what I'm learning from that. So whoever it is that's punishing Moab is a tool of God. Nebuchadnezzar is a tool of God. Egypt at times was a tool of God. U.S. may be a tool of God. Russia may be a tool of God. China may be a tool of God. Iran may be a tool of God. God can use wicked nations as tools. And his point is, he's going to punish the nation that's not named here, by the way, but he'll punish any nation that doesn't do the job he wants them to do. In other words, if I'm wanting them to go in and take this nation and they don't, then they're going to be taken care of. They're my tool, and if a tool's no good, you throw it away. That's the idea. Now, notice, this is quite interesting to me at verse 11. Moab has been at ease from his youth and settled on his dregs. That's one of two places, Zephaniah 1:12 is where a similar phrase is used, settled on his dregs. This is from Clark and Hatton, Translator's Handbook. It said, I will punish the men who are thickening up on their lees. The Hebrew metaphor is drawn from the process of wine making, where the wine is fermented and it's poured from one vessel to another to separate the wine from the sediment, which is called lees or dregs. The process is described in Jeremiah 48:11. That's where we are. When that's not done, the wine becomes too sweet and spoils. And the verb translated thickening here means to condense or congeal. The men are thickening up on their lees, are the people who've enjoyed uninterrupted wealth for too long, and thus they become self-satisfied. So just as there hasn't been the separation of the wine from the dregs or the lees, that sediment down there, he's saying you're settled on your lees, you're settled on your dregs. You've been complacent because you've just sat in a tub of butter, as we'd call it in our day and time. You've been sitting in a tub of butter too long. And therefore, that may explain their pride. I just find that fascinating and interesting. Zephaniah 1:12 uses a very similar phrase. Now, let's jump on to verse 14 now. Moab's glory is going to be turned to shame. Who can say we are mighty and strong men of war? And the answer is, or the response is, that her chosen men have gone down to slaughter. You got any mighty men among you? Moab? Yeah, we've got some. Well, they've just been slaughtered. They're not so mighty after all. Notice at verse 11, how the staff is broken in the beautiful rod. God's took their staff and broken their staff. Notice at verse 25. The horn of Moab is cut off and the arm is broken. One writer suggests that one has reference to the power, the other their authority, and God's taken their power and their authority and broken them, just like breaking someone's arm. I broke your arm, I broke your strength, I broke your power, and I broke your authority. I'm done with you, Moab. And now notice verse 26. And you might make a note to see verse 42 and go over to 42 and say, put a note to see verse 46. Make him drunk, for he magnified himself against the Lord. And God said, I'll make him vomit and wallow in his vomit. Now, we're going to notice a couple of things and then we're going to move on. Look at verse 29. We've heard of the pride of Moab. That's the reason Moab is coming down. Now, I want to jump on down. Again, Mark verse 46. Verse 42, I'm sorry. Magnified himself against their God. Now, verse 47. Let's end this so we can get to chapter 49. I want to comment about 49, and we've got about 5 minutes here. But at the end of verse 47, this is part of that smite and heal. And so we have the messianic section, that I will bring back the captives of Moab in the latter days. I think that's messianic. I think it has to be. Because I don't know of anything in history that we can trace that says that they were rebuilt. And God had said he'd make an utter end of the nations, and he does. So he's going to punish Moab. But then there's this messianic section. And so what are we supposed to get out of that? That people from any nation and from all nations can be in the kingdom. Now let's quickly get to 48. Now 40, what's the next one? 49. Let's quickly get to it. I know our time's running close. So let's see what we can do with 49. There are 5 nations mentioned here. And there's the Ammonites, Edom, Syria, Kedar, and Hazor, and Elam. And so here's the first. Here we have the Dead Sea, the Salt Sea, and then there is Ammon. This is Moab here, so just to the northeast is Ammon. So let's talk about Ammon verses 1 to 6. See what we can do with Ammon. Ammon are kinsmen to Israel. Ammon was a son of Lot by incest. Genesis chapter 19, verse 38. And so that's why he starts with, has Israel no sons? Has he no heir? And why has Milcom, that's one of their gods, why did he inherit Gad? Now notice at verse 2, what's happening is that they're desolate. Verse 3, notice the word plundered. And notice that their self-sufficiency and their arrogance. They had said at the end of verse 4, who will come up against me? And maybe we're that way in the U.S. I'm talking about just as a nation politically, or what we think about our nation. We've got the strongest military on earth, at least we're supposed to. And who on earth wants to mess with us? Who in the world would want to mess with the U.S.? I want to tell you, we got the most powerful military on earth. Who wants to mess with us? I'll tell you what, when God's got ready for somebody to deal with us, our military can't stand it when God's through with them. I don't care what. That's not an anti-military statement. There's no military on earth can stand against the forces of God. So if God wants Russia to take us, Russia will take us. If he wants Iran to take us, Iran will take us. If he wants Mexico to take us, Mexico will take us. And you say, well, they're not powerful enough. If God's behind them, they're powerful enough. They can do that. Anyway, enough preaching on that. Now let's notice they just think they're just too big for their britches is the point. Now notice at the end of verse 6, here again is this smite and heal. And so you might mark at the end the captives of the people of Ammon, that afterward I will bring back the captives. And that's messianic, I tell you. Now let's talk about Edom. Now this is an interesting section. A couple of things we want to point out about Edom. We've talked about Ammon, and Edom is right here, south of the Salt Sea. And so you have Moab. So just south of the Salt Sea is the land of Edom. These are the descendants of Esau. Now what do we see here? I want to make a couple of points here, and then we may have to forego some of the rest. Because this is fascinating. Look at verse 9. If the generally great gatherers come in and they leave a little behind, and so what's the point? That God's saying, I'm going to be more thorough. In other words, I'm going to thoroughly take care of Edom is what I'm going to do. Verse 12, none are going to escape. And why is this going on? Look at verse 16, the pride of your heart. You might underline that. They're going to be desolate, verse 18. And behold, he shall come up like a lion from the flooding of the Jordan. And notice, this is the point I was making a little bit ago at the end of verse 19, basically, is who can withstand me? Who can stand against the Lord is the question. When the Lord is ready to deal with Moab, who's going to stand against the Lord? Now, before we leave, and then he pictures there's great fear when this destruction comes. Now, I've got to mention this. If you're familiar with the minor prophets, you jump over to Obadiah, and you read Obadiah, and you say, wait a minute, I think I just read that over in Jeremiah 49. Well, not the whole thing, but parts of it. But there's some of the messages reversed. I don't mean in intent, but sections of it. For example, what you have in Jeremiah 49, and the first part is the second part that's mentioned over in Obadiah. And what is the first part in Obadiah is mentioned secondly here in Jeremiah. It's reversed. So there's some question, and I just want to touch on this question. Commentators deal with this. It's the same message, but again, it's not in the same order. And so the general interpretation of that is that Obadiah prophesied earlier, about 580 something, if I remember right. Not 5, but 8 something earlier. And he was one of the earlier prophets. And so consequently, that Jeremiah may be quoting from him. And that's possible. That's one explanation of that. Some have said that maybe Obadiah and Jeremiah are the same, probably the same man, and that he really was prophesying closer to this time. That's one interpretation. But another interpretation, and it seems to be the more common one, and I think probably explains it better, is that both were speaking from the same source. Some think that means they're quoting from a third source somewhere else. I think they're both speaking by inspiration and speaking from the same God. And that explains why some of the phraseology is the same. Humphreys makes this argument on this point. He says that it shows that they spoke with unity and with one voice. That what was said earlier, if Obadiah is an earlier prophet, and what Jeremiah says now, God spoke with one voice and spoke the same message to the same nation. And why is he quoting so? I don't know that any of us know with certainty. Kaiser, I believe, was the one who made that observation. Well, our time's gone. But what you have then is Syria, which is north of Palestine. Kedar and Hazar are not nations as such. These were nomadic tribes, and they're dealt with. And then Elam is dealt with, and much of the same thing is said again. Now, what we're going to do next time is pick up with, and by the way, Mark verse 39 is messianic, because there's that smite and heal again. We can't leave without making that mention. Verse 39, ending 49, is again that messianic, that smite and heal. We'll stop with that.